This story is based on true events. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I always thought that those stories were just figments of people's imaginations, designed to scare and entertain. That was until I moved into the house on Elm Street. The house had been on the market for years. It was an old Victorian-style home, built in the late 1800s, with ornate woodwork, stained glass windows, and a sense of grandeur that had long since faded. The previous owners had abandoned it, and it had fallen into disrepair. Despite its dilapidated state, I saw potential. I imagined myself restoring it to its former glory, and the price was unbeatable. So, I bought it. From the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The air was heavy, the shadows seemed to move on their own, and there was an unsettling stillness that made my skin crawl. But I brushed it off as nerves and the creaking of an old house. The first few nights were uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd often hear faint whispers just on the edge of my hearing, but I attributed it to my imagination. It wasn't until the third night that things took a turn for the worse. I woke up at exactly 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps echoing through the hallways. I lived alone, so the noise immediately set me on edge. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way downstairs. The footsteps seemed to be coming from the basement, a place I had yet to venture into. With each step down the creaking wooden staircase, the air grew colder. My breath became visible, and I could feel a presence, something malevolent, watching me. When I reached the bottom, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I stood frozen, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I fumbled with the flashlight, managing to get it working again, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the corner of the basement, was a figure. It was a woman, or at least it had been. Her hair was matted, her eyes hollow, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. She was transparent, like a wisp of smoke, but her presence was undeniably real. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure began to move toward me, her mouth opening wider, as if to scream, but no sound came out. I turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I could still feel her presence, even as I ran back to my bedroom and locked the door. That night, I barely slept. The next day, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my mind playing tricks on me in the darkness. But deep down, I knew it was real. Over the next few weeks, the hauntings became more frequent. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut, and I'd wake up with scratches on my arms and legs. The whispers grew louder, and the apparition of the woman became a regular visitor in the dead of night. Desperate for answers, I began to research the history of the house. I discovered that it had once belonged to a wealthy family in the late 1800s. The patriarch of the family, a man named Samuel Blackwood, was a cruel and sadistic figure who was rumored to have dabbled in dark rituals and the occult. His wife, Eliza, had died under mysterious circumstances, and their daughter, Mary, had disappeared without a trace. The townsfolk believed that Samuel had murdered his wife and daughter, using their deaths to fuel his dark practices. After his death, the house had changed hands several times, with each owner experiencing strange and terrifying occurrences. Many had fled, leaving the house abandoned until I purchased it. As I delved deeper into the house's history, the hauntings grew more violent. I would wake up with bruises and cuts, and the sense of malevolence became overwhelming. I knew I had to do something, or I would end up like the others who had lived here before me. Determined to rid the house of its malevolent presence, I contacted a local paranormal investigator named Dr. Evelyn Harper. She was well known in the community for her expertise in dealing with haunted locations. When I told her about my experiences, she agreed to help. Dr. Harper arrived one evening, bringing with her an array of equipment designed to detect and communicate with spirits. As she set up, she explained that the key to ending the hauntings was to understand the spirits' stories and help them find peace. We began our investigation in the basement, where I had first encountered the apparition. The atmosphere was oppressive, and the temperature plummeted as we descended the stairs. Dr. Harper set up a series of devices, an EMF meter, digital recorders, and a spirit box designed to capture and translate spirit communications. As we stood in the darkness, the EMF meter began to spike. Dr. Harper asked the spirit to make its presence known, and the spirit box crackled to life. Through the static, we heard a faint, distorted voice. "Mary, help me." The voice sent chills down my spine. Dr. Harper continued to ask questions, and slowly, the story began to unfold. Mary, the daughter of Samuel Blackwood, had been murdered by her father in a fit of rage. Her spirit had been trapped in the house, bound by the dark rituals Samuel had performed. We moved through the house, following the trail of the EMF spikes and the voice on the spirit box. In the living room, we found another hotspot of activity. The furniture shook, and the air grew colder. We heard the voice again, this time more desperate. "Eliza, save her." Dr. Harper explained that Eliza, Samuel's wife, had tried to protect Mary from her husband's wrath, but had been killed in the process. Her spirit was also trapped, reliving the horror of that night over and over again. Our final stop was the attic, a place I had always felt a sense of dread. As we climbed the rickety stairs, the sense of malevolence grew stronger. The attic was filled with old, forgotten belongings covered in dust. In the corner, we found an old, leather-bound book. It was Samuel Blackwood's journal, filled with detailed accounts of his dark rituals and the sacrifices he had made. Dr. Harper instructed me to read an incantation from the journal. She believed it was the key to breaking the curse and freeing the spirits. As I read the words aloud, the air grew thick with tension. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows deepened. Suddenly, the apparition of Samuel Blackwood appeared before us, his eyes burning with hatred. He lunged at me, but Dr. Harper intervened, chanting a counterspell. The room filled with a blinding light, and the spirits of Mary and Eliza appeared, standing between us and Samuel. With a final scream of rage, Samuel's apparition was pulled into the light and vanished. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the temperature returned to normal. Mary and Eliza's spirits smiled, their forms becoming more solid and peaceful. They thanked us before fading away, finally free from the torment that had bound them to the house. I sold the house shortly after that night. I couldn't bear to stay there any longer, despite knowing the spirits were at peace. The memories of what I had experienced still haunt me, and I often wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to see the ghostly figure of Mary standing at the foot of my bed. The house on Elm Street now stands empty once again, a silent witness to the horrors that unfolded within its walls. And while I no longer live there, I carry the weight of its dark history with me, a constant reminder that some stories are all too real. This story is based on true events. Growing up in a small, secluded town, I had always heard stories about the old doll-maker who lived on the outskirts. People said he was eccentric, a recluse who had moved into the abandoned mansion at the edge of the woods. He rarely ventured into town, and when he did, his presence was unsettling. Children would whisper that his dolls were cursed, each one harboring a piece of a tormented soul. I never believed those stories until I experienced the terror firsthand. I was 16 when my family moved into the old house next to the dollmaker's mansion. It was an unexpected move. My father had inherited the property from a distant relative. From the moment we arrived, I felt an eerie presence, as if unseen eyes were watching our every move. The mansion next door loomed ominously, its once grand facade now decaying and covered in ivy. My parents dismissed my unease, attributing it to the unfamiliar surroundings. They were excited about the new start, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, as I explored the dense woods behind our house, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated workshop, its windows covered in grime and its door slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of me, and I ventured inside. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of old wood and mildew filled my nostrils. Inside, I found shelves lined with porcelain dolls, each one more lifelike than the last. They stared at me with glassy eyes, their expressions disturbingly human. As I moved deeper into the workshop, I discovered a back room filled with unfinished dolls and strange tools. On a dusty workbench, I found a journal. Its pages were filled with sketches and notes about the dollmaker's work, detailing his process for capturing and binding souls into his creations. The entries grew increasingly erratic, describing how the dolls would move on their own, whispering in the dead of night. The final entry was a frantic scrawl. "The souls are restless. They want to be free. They're coming for me." Chilled to the bone, I decided to leave, but as I turned to go, I heard a faint whisper. It was a child's voice, pleading for help. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. I followed the sound to a corner of the room where a small, unfinished doll lay. Its eyes were wide open, and its tiny mouth moved as it repeated the plea. Terrified, I grabbed the doll and ran back to my house. That night, I couldn't sleep. The doll sat on my desk, its eyes seemingly following me. The whispering continued, growing louder until it filled the room. Desperate for answers, I returned to the workshop the next day. As I rummaged through the dollmaker's journal again, I discovered a hidden compartment in the back of the workbench. Inside was a collection of old letters, written by the dollmaker to his deceased wife. In them, he confessed to practicing dark magic in an attempt to bring her back to life. He had begun capturing souls, binding them to his dolls, hoping one would be powerful enough to resurrect her. Instead, he had created an army of tormented spirits, trapped within their porcelain prisons. The letters revealed that the dollmaker had died under mysterious circumstances, his body found in the workshop surrounded by his creations. His death was attributed to a heart attack, but the townsfolk believed it was the dolls that had killed him, seeking revenge for their entrapment. I knew I had to free the souls trapped within the dolls. That night, I returned to the workshop, bringing the unfinished doll with me. I gathered all the dolls and placed them in a circle, hoping to perform a ritual to release the spirits. As I began reading from the journal, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the doll's eyes seemed to glow with an eerie light. Suddenly, the workshop door slammed shut, and a chilling wind swept through the room. The dolls began to move, their heads turning to face me, their tiny hands reaching out. I continued reading, my voice shaking with fear. The dolls' whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, each one filled with pain and anger. As I reached the final incantation, a blinding light filled the room. The dolls convulsed, their porcelain bodies cracking and shattering. The souls, now freed, swirled around me, their voices a chorus of gratitude and sorrow. The wind died down, and the light faded, leaving the workshop in darkness. I stumbled out of the workshop, exhausted but relieved. The dolls were gone, their spirits finally at peace. I thought the nightmare was over, but I was wrong. The next few weeks were eerily quiet. The oppressive feeling that had hung over our house seemed to lift, and I began to relax. But then, strange things started happening. Objects would move on their own, and I would hear faint whispers in the dead of night. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the occurrences became more frequent and more violent. One night, I woke up to find the unfinished doll I had taken from the workshop sitting at the foot of my bed. I had left it in the workshop, convinced it was the source of the whispers. My heart raced as I stared at it, its eyes glinting in the moonlight. I reached out to touch it, and a cold hand grabbed mine. I screamed and yanked my hand away. The doll fell to the floor, and the room filled with an icy wind. The whispers grew louder, forming words. "You freed us, but one remains. Find the final piece." The next morning, I searched the house for any sign of the final piece the spirits had mentioned. I scoured the workshop, the woods, and the mansion next door, but found nothing. The hauntings continued to escalate, each night more terrifying than the last. I knew I had to find the final piece and put an end to the curse. One evening, as I was searching the attic of our house, I found an old, locked trunk. It was hidden beneath a pile of dusty blankets and forgotten belongings. With trembling hands, I forced the lock open. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs, letters, and a small, intricately carved box. The photographs showed the doll maker and his family, including his wife and daughter. The letters were addressed to his wife, detailing his descent into madness as he tried to bring her back. But it was the box that caught my attention. It was covered in strange symbols and felt unnaturally cold to the touch. I opened the box, revealing a small, delicate porcelain heart. It was the final piece. As I held it, the whispers intensified, and the room grew colder. The spirits were restless, demanding to be freed. I took the heart to the workshop and placed it in the center of the room. I gathered the remnants of the broken dolls and arranged them around the heart, hoping to perform one final ritual. As I began reading from the journal, the wind picked up, and the whispers turned into screams. The doll's shattered pieces began to move, drawn to the heart. The room was filled with a blinding light, and I could feel the spirit's anger and desperation. I continued the incantation, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. Suddenly, the light intensified, and the doll's pieces fused together, forming a grotesque, twisted figure. It stood before me, its eyes glowing with malevolent intent. It reached out, and I felt a cold hand around my throat. With my last breath, I recited the final words of the incantation. The figure convulsed, its grip loosening. The light grew brighter, and the figure began to dissolve. The spirits were finally free, their tormented cries fading into the night. The workshop was left in ruins. The dolls remained scattered across the floor. The oppressive feeling that had haunted me for so long was gone. I left the workshop, feeling a sense of relief and closure. I moved away from the town shortly after, unable to bear the memories of what had happened. But even now, years later, I can still feel the cold hand around my throat, and I hear the whispers in my dreams. The doll-maker's curse may have been broken, but its legacy will haunt me forever. This story is based on true events. I should have never taken the job. That thought crosses my mind often now, as I sit here recounting the events that changed my life forever. I was fresh out of college, eager to prove myself as a journalist. When my editor handed me the assignment to investigate the old Maplewood Asylum, I jumped at the chance. Little did I know, it would lead me into the depths of terror I could never have imagined. Maplewood Asylum had been abandoned for decades. The stories surrounding it were legendary in our town, tales of patients who were mistreated, tortured, and forgotten. The asylum had closed its doors in the 1970s after a series of unexplained deaths and disappearances. It was said to be haunted by the souls of those who had suffered there. Naturally, I thought it was all urban legend, but I needed a good story, and a haunted asylum was perfect for a Halloween feature. Equipped with my camera, a flashlight, and a digital recorder, I set out for the asylum on a chilly October night. The building loomed in the distance as I approached, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. Ivy and vines covered the crumbling facade, and broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets. The air around the place felt heavy, almost oppressive. The front door was ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the smell of mold and decay was overwhelming. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing long-abandoned furniture, rusted medical equipment, and faded, peeling wallpaper. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional scuttle of rodents and the distant drip of water. I began my exploration in the main hall, taking photographs and recording my observations. The place was a maze of corridors and rooms, each more decrepit than the last. As I moved deeper into the building, I stumbled upon the patient records room. Files and papers were strewn everywhere, detailing the lives and tragedies of those who had been confined here. The stories were heartbreaking. People locked away for reasons that would be considered absurd today. Depression, epilepsy, even homosexuality. One file caught my eye. It was thicker than the others, marked with a red stamp that read, "High Risk." The patient's name was Alice Hamilton, admitted in 1963 for severe schizophrenia. According to the notes, she had been subjected to numerous experimental treatments, including electroshock therapy and lobotomy. The last entry mentioned that she had disappeared without a trace in 1969, just before the asylum closed. As I read through Alice's file, I felt a sudden chill, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner of the room. Shaking off the unease, I continued my investigation, determined to uncover more about Alice and the asylum's dark history. In the basement, I found the remnants of what must have been the operating theater. The rusted surgical tools and blood-stained floor were a grim reminder of the horrors that had taken place there. I took several photographs, documenting the eerie scene. As I was about to leave, I noticed a narrow passageway hidden behind a collapsed wall. It led to a locked door, which I managed to force open with a crowbar I had found earlier. The room beyond was small and windowless, with walls lined with shelves containing jars of preserved organs. In the center of the room stood a metal table, and on it lay a tattered diary. It belonged to Dr. Isaac Whitaker, the head physician at Maplewood. The entries detailed his descent into madness, driven by his obsession with curing mental illness through any means necessary. He wrote about his experiments on Alice Hamilton, describing her as the most challenging case he had ever encountered. The final entry was particularly disturbing. It read, "Alice's spirit is restless. She haunts these halls, seeking vengeance for the torment she endured. I fear her wrath will consume us all." Just as I finished reading, I heard a soft whisper, like a distant echo. My flashlight flickered again, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. Panicked, I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The whispers grew louder, forming words. "Help me. Find me." My heart pounded as I frantically searched for another way out. In my desperation, I knocked over one of the shelves, revealing a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside was a small, leather-bound notebook. It was Alice's diary. Her entries were filled with anguish and fear, describing the tortures she had endured and her desire for revenge against Dr. Whitaker. As I read the final page, the air grew colder, and the whispers became a cacophony of anguished cries. I felt a presence behind me, and when I turned, I saw her, a ghostly figure, her face twisted in pain and anger. Alice Hamilton stood before me, her eyes hollow and her mouth open in a silent scream. I froze in terror as Alice's ghostly figure moved closer. Her hand reached out, and I felt an icy grip on my arm. "Find me," she whispered, her voice echoing in the small room. "Find my body and set me free." My mind raced as I tried to comprehend what she was asking. Her body? Could it be that her remains were still hidden somewhere in the asylum? Determined to escape the room and fulfill her request, I grabbed the diaries and forced myself to focus. Using the crowbar, I pried open a vent in the wall and crawled through, emerging into a long-forgotten corridor. The corridor led to a series of rooms that were not on the asylum's original blueprints. They seemed to be private chambers for the staff, perhaps where they conducted their most secret and unethical experiments. Each room was filled with old equipment, strange contraptions, and more jars of preserved organs. The air was thick with the scent of decay and rot. I searched room after room, but there was no sign of Alice's body. The whispers followed me, urging me on, guiding me deeper into the labyrinth. Eventually, I reached a heavy, reinforced door marked Isolation. It was locked, but using the crowbar, I managed to break the rusted hinges and force it open. Inside, the room was bare except for a single iron bed and a large wooden chest. The walls were covered in scratch marks, and the air was even colder here. With trembling hands, I opened the chest. Inside, wrapped in a tattered sheet, were the skeletal remains of a young woman. It had to be Alice. As I gently unwrapped the bones, the room filled with a blinding light. Alice's spirit appeared once more, but this time her expression was one of relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and filled with gratitude. "Now, set me free." I carried her remains outside, the whispers growing fainter with each step. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the decrepit asylum. I found a spot beneath an ancient oak tree and began to dig. As I buried her bones, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the place seemed to lift. With the last handful of earth, the whispers ceased, and Alice's spirit faded into the morning light. The asylum stood silent, no longer haunted by the tormented souls of its past. I returned to the house, exhausted but determined to share Alice's story with the world. Back at my office, I wrote the article, detailing everything I had discovered. The piece was published, and it caused quite a stir in our town. The old legends were confirmed, and the site was declared a historical landmark. But for me, the experience was more than just a story. It was a reminder of the horrors that can be hidden in plain sight, and the power of a restless spirit seeking justice. Even now, years later, I can still feel the cold grip of Alice's hand on my arm and hear her whispers in the dead of night. The memory of that night in Maplewood Asylum will haunt me forever, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the human soul.